of the semester, but we still have the laboratory today, of course. I guess I don't have any super special announcements. Friday is part of finals week, so we will not meet here on, what am I saying? We will meet here on Friday, but not for the lecture, for the final exam. Everybody remember when it is on Friday? 11:30. Yeah, very good. And here in this room. And at first I told you to get the brown version of this form, but I visited the bookstore and just like somebody told me that it's no longer available, so the green form is the correct one to get. The 100 multiple choice question green sheet. And of course a number 2 pencil. Okay? All right, well, we're going to work again on the evolution lecture. I'll probably have to skip a few bits in it just to try to get us out of here on time. But I hope to convey the main gist, the main points of the theory of evolution. And I think I ended last time on Darwin. Remember that there was a couple of influential scientists that came before him. There was a French scientist named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he was one of the first ones to say that species evolve, that one species can turn into a different species. But he got the mechanism wrong. He thought that the traits you inherit over your lifetime, like stretching your neck to a longer length, could turn into genetic traits and be passed on to offspring, and that's just not correct. And this Charles Lyell fella was a geologist who wrote a book stating how the current feature of the Earth are the products of slow gradual change that's been going on for millions of years, and you can still see those same processes shaping the features of the Earth today. And part of what Darwin did is take Lyell's ideas and apply them to living things, to organisms rather than geological features of the Earth. But probably Darwin's biggest influence in his theory of evolution was his trip to the Galapagos Islands, along with as part of a British sailing vessel called the HMS Beagle that was mapping the coastlines of South America. And they eventually went to this group of islands called the Galapagos Islands, which is, darn this laser pen, right, well anyway, you see it off on the left-hand side there, off the coast of Ecuador, right around there. Apparently this island chain is 500 miles off the coast of Ecuador. Very volcanic, dry islands. And while visiting the Galapagos, Darwin cataloged the number of finch birds he saw, and he totaled 14 finch species there living on this island. And when they were on the main coast, the mainland of Ecuador, 500 miles away, they saw finches also, and some of those were somewhat similar to the ones on the island, but none of them were the exact same species. And the idea that a species like these birds could go from the mainland to the island was not impossible to think of, even though these birds don't migrate over long distances, like hundreds of miles. If they were blown by a storm, if like one or two individuals were blown from a storm, or I should say a small flock was blown by a storm from the mainland out at sea, they would probably settle on the first land that they came across, such as the Galapagos. There was my little cartoon of that. There they go. But it would be highly unlikely that 14 different species this would have happened to. And so Darwin puzzled over how you could get the 14 different species there. And he eventually decided probably it was just one flock, one species that came over, and somehow it evolved into these 14 different ones on the island. And so that really cemented in his mind that Lamarck was right, that species do evolve, but he didn't know exactly how it happened at first. He didn't know the mechanism. He knew that Lamarck's idea of acquired characteristics was wrong, but he didn't know what the correct idea was. So anyway, the Darwin and the rest of the crew of the Beagle finished the trip, And I think they got back to England around 1833, if I remember correctly. There they are, around 1833. And Darwin slowly, over about the next 20 years, began fleshing out his ideas of mechanisms of evolution. And eventually, in 1859, he wrote this book called The Origin of Species by Natural Selection. And if you look at the time frame, this is about the same time that Mendel was doing his experiments with peas, working out how genetics worked. So Darwin and Mendel were contemporaries, but they weren't aware of each other, which is kind of a shame, because if Darwin had known Mendel's ideas of how genetics worked, that probably would have helped him formulate his ideas of natural selection sooner than he did. Oh yeah, there's the cover of the book. So here's the gist of what Darwin came up with as how species evolve, the mechanism by natural selection. And we'll use the giraffes again, which are the same animal that I illustrated Lamarck's idea of evolution with. So Darwin said, all right, if you look at any species, when they produce their offspring, there is genetic variation among the offspring, just meaning that not all the offspring are exact clones of each other. In any trait you look at, there's going to be differences. Some's necks will be a little longer than the others. Probably the color of their eyeballs will vary slightly different from one individual to another. The digestive enzymes they make in their stomachs will probably be a bit different from one to another. There's always going to be some genetic variation among the offspring. And Darwin said, some of these traits help your survival more than others. For instance, if you're trying to, if food is scarce and you're trying to eat these leaves up here at the top of the tree, it's better to have a slightly longer neck than a slightly shorter neck. And so if you are a longer neck one, if you're lucky to get those genes for longer neck, you're going to tend to survive better than the other ones in your group, which is going to mean you're going to leave more offspring. And so you'll tend to pass on those beneficial genes, those beneficial alleles to your offspring. And so your offspring will have the same advantage and will tend to then leave more offspring in the next generation. So gradually over time, as those genes for the longer neck move into the population, those are the ones that survive. So the population gets longer and longer necks. And the ones that didn't have those beneficial alleles, well, they weren't so lucky, and they end up dying off. And so over many generations, the necks get longer and longer. And that is the theory of natural selection. And so notice it is more consistent with how genetics actually works. We know that there is genetic variation among offspring, and that those traits can be passed down from one generation to another. So over time, the population can change. Now, I want to go on a kind of a tangent here for a minute and talk about, well, where exactly does this genetic variation in the offspring come from each generation? And a lot of this we covered already, that even from one set of parents, like one female dog and one male dog, you're going to get a lot of differences in what the offspring look like. You can look at the puppies here. You can see there, at least as far as their coat color is concerned, there's quite a bit of variation there. And a lot of this comes from when the parents are making their gametes, when they're making the sperm and eggs, the crossing over in the independent assortment of genes makes the gametes very different from each other. And I guess we don't have time to fully review those concepts, but essentially independent assortment and crossing over will guarantee that all the sperm that are made, that a man makes, are essentially different from each other, and all the eggs that a woman makes are different from each other. Okay, there's a diagram of crossing over. You might remember when we talked about meiosis, I drew a mathematical equation like this. I said that for any one of your genes, there's really two choices that you can pass on to a sperm or to an egg. You can pass on the copy of that gene that you inherited from your mother, or you can pass on the copy of that gene that you inherited from your father. But we don't just have two genes, we have 25,000 genes. And so if each gene assorts independently, the chances of any sperm or egg getting your maternal copy of that gene versus your paternal copy of that gene is an equal 50-50 shot, then there's actually 2 to the 25,000 different types of gametes you can make. You can make whatever that number is, just gigantic number, 2 to the 25,000 sperm, or you can make 2 to the 25,000 different eggs. And so it's really no surprise that you can get a whole bunch of variation in the offspring, even from just 2 parents. And remember that the offspring are going to have features, or can potentially have features, that are very different from either parent. This shows some a skin color bar graph. Imagine that there's 2 parents, and if we look at their genes for melanin, which controls the color of your skin, and let's say each parent was like this for the melanin making genes. Like that, and here's the other parent. Well, if these genes for making melanin are incompletely dominant, as they believe they are, then all it comes down to, what your skin color is determined by, is how many of the dominant alleles you get. So you get a medium brown parent here and a medium brown parent there. But it's possible, not likely, but it certainly is possible, that the offspring will inherit the dominant A, dominant B, and dominant C from this parent, and the same from that parent there. So you can get an offspring that's extremely dark, has all the dominant melanin-making alleles, very different from both parents. Or it's also possible that the offspring might inherit the recessive alleles from each parent, so you could get an extremely light-skinned offspring from these 2 parents. Or you could potentially get an offspring that looks a little bit more like the parents, something like this, 3 dominant alleles and 3 recessive alleles. So the point here is that just by having different combinations of the parents' alleles, there's going to be quite a bit of variation among the offspring. And that's just part of where the genetic variation comes from. There's also this idea of mutations, even above and beyond the alleles that the offspring inherits from the parents. New alleles can form when the sequences in the DNA get changed by various things like radiation and mutagenic chemicals in the foods that we're exposed to. And so all it takes really is one nucleotide in the gene changing, and then that mutation will be passed on to the mRNA, of course, which, since that encodes the protein, you could end up getting a new protein out of this. And remember, most of the time that's going to make a non-functional protein. You'll just sort of end up with a denatured protein, a non-functional protein. So I guess that would be a new non-functioning recessive allele. But in some cases, you'll actually improve the protein. You can imagine a mutation that's either going to make the binding site a little bit better, it binds the substrate a little bit better, or perhaps it'll change the binding site so much that an entirely different substrate will be bound by this enzyme, and you've created essentially a new gene for some new metabolic reaction that hasn't been taking place before. Okay, does that sound alrighty so far? All right, so when I was illustrating the Darwin's theory of natural selection with the giraffes here, I said, let's imagine that having a longer neck is beneficial. I guess the giraffes are reaching up to get the higher leaves or something like that. And so one extreme of the phenotype in that case is best. In other words, the longer you are with the neck, the more beneficial it is to you. Gesundheit. And if you think about it, a lot of traits that we see in living things are distributed in something of a bell-shaped curve. That if you think about the neck length, or how tall people are, or the color of the skin, you can have very little of the trait, extremely light skin or extremely short neck or extremely small. And you could have the other extreme of the trait, very dark skin or very long neck or extremely tall, or you can fall somewhere in the middle of the bell curve in any particular trait you can think of. Well, the people who study evolution talk about 3 different types of natural selection that there can be. Basically, 3 different ways natural selection can tweak the bell curve of a population's genetic traits. The kind we talked about with the giraffes would be an example of directional selection, where the alleles for one extreme of the bell curve are the best ones, the ones that help you survive. So if it's best to be either the minimum of the trait or the maximum of the trait, that's directional selection. And the giraffes were believed to have been a good example of that. And they think the same thing holds true for the size of horses. When they look at the fossil record, they find very small species of horses which are now extinct. And so if you can go back in time and look at that small horse ancestor population, this would be the bell curve of their size distribution. But the larger body size was apparently beneficial, because when they look a little bit later on in the fossil record, they see that the horse size has shifted again, moving towards the right of the bell curve.